Tonight we begin with the remarkable stories of the most wanted people in medieval history. Those infamous names whispered in candlelit taverns, carved into royal decrees, and occasionally scribbled onto wanted posters. Assuming the monk hadn't run out of parchment or motivation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The concept of being wanted in medieval times was quite different from our modern understanding, with its computerized databases and instant global communication. Instead, being declared an outlaw, literally outside the law, meant you had been stripped of legal protections and could be killed by anyone without consequence. It was a terrifying status that turned every stranger into a potential executioner and every forest path into a gauntlet of danger. But some people didn't just survive this status, they thrived in it, becoming legends whose names echoed through centuries and whose exploits inspired countless stories, songs, and eventually Hollywood movies. These weren't always the noble heroes of folklore. Many were genuinely dangerous criminals, while others were political dissidents, religious heretics, or simply people who ran afoul of a corrupt system that turned ordinary citizens into fugitives for offenses as minor as poaching a rabbit to feed their starving families. Let's begin with perhaps the most famous outlaw in history, though you might be surprised to learn how little we actually know about him. Robin Hood. The name conjures immediate images of Lincoln Green, Sherwood Forest, Maid Marian, and arrows splitting arrows in archery contests. But the historical Robin Hood, if he existed at all, was likely far removed from these romantic images. The earliest references to Robin Hood appear in ballads from the 1300s, at least a century after he supposedly lived. These early stories don't portray a noble Saxon fighting Norman oppression, as later versions would claim. Instead, they describe a violent yeoman, a member of the middle class, who had no particular love for the poor and whose main activity seemed to be ambushing travelers and fighting with authorities. The original Robin Hood tales contains surprisingly brutal violence. In one early ballad, Robin Hood and his men murder a child in cold blood simply because he'd witnessed one of their crimes. In another, Robin casually decapitates a monk. These weren't exactly the family-friendly adventures we know from Disney movies. But here's what makes the Robin Hood legend so fascinating from a historical perspective. Whether or not he was real, the charges that would have made someone like him an outlaw were very real and very common. Medieval England had extraordinarily harsh forest laws that made it illegal for common people to hunt game or even gather fallen wood in royal forests. A peasant who killed a deer to feed his family faced execution or mutilation. Often the loss of fingers, hands, or even blinding. These forest laws created thousands of outlaws across medieval England. Men who committed what we might consider minor environmental crimes were forced to flee into the very forests they'd been accused of poaching from, living in makeshift camps, surviving on whatever they could hunt or steal, and occasionally robbing travelers who passed through their territory. One documented outlaw who resembled the Robin Hood legend was Fulk Fitzwarren, a nobleman who was declared an outlaw in 1200 after a dispute with King John, yes, the same King John from the Robin Hood stories. Fulk spent several years as a fugitive, conducting guerrilla warfare against the king's forces, hiding in forests, and according to contemporary accounts, robbing from the rich to fund his rebellion. Unlike the fictional Robin Hood, Fulk eventually made peace with King John and had his lands restored. He died peacefully in his bed many years later, which is a far more satisfying ending than most real outlaws achieved. Moving to a different kind of outlaw, let's discuss Eustace the monk, a genuinely fascinating figure whose real-life exploits were so extraordinary that medieval writers struggled to explain them, and eventually decided he must have been using black magic. Eustace was a Benedictine monk who left his monastery after his father was murdered, became a mercenary, developed a reputation as a brilliant naval commander, and spent years as a pirate terrorizing the English Channel. Eustace's story begins in northern France around 1170. He was the son of a lord and received monastic education, but after his father's murder and a dispute over the family's lands, Eustace abandoned his religious vows and set out for revenge. According to medieval chronicles, he became extraordinarily skilled at disguise, infiltration, and deception, traits that seemed so uncanny to his contemporaries that they assumed demonic assistance. Medieval accounts describe Eustace disguising himself as a merchant, a pilgrim, a leper, a woman, and even in one particularly bold story, as a royal messenger carrying orders to arrest himself. He supposedly walked into enemy camps, attended banquets at the homes of people who wanted him dead, and escaped from seemingly impossible situations through clever disguises and quick thinking. What made Eustace genuinely dangerous, though, was his naval expertise. He commanded a fleet of ships that controlled the English Channel at various points, serving first the French king, then the English, then the French again, selling his services to whoever paid best. His ships raided coastal towns, intercepted merchant vessels, and transported armies across the Channel. Eustace's career ended in 1217 at the Battle of Sandwich, where his ship was captured during a naval engagement. According to chroniclers, Eustace offered an enormous ransom for his freedom, but English sailors, who had suffered from his piracy for years, refused and executed him on the spot by beheading him on his own ship's deck. The chronicles describe his death with a certain satisfaction, noting that his body was taken to Canterbury and displayed as proof that the notorious pirate monk was finally dead. even in death, Eustace's reputation for supernatural abilities persisted, with some chroniclers suggesting that his dark arts had finally failed him. Now let's turn to a completely different type of wanted fugitive, William Wallace of Scotland, whose story you probably know from the movie Braveheart, which got almost everything wrong except that he existed and fought against English rule. The real Wallace was far more interesting than Mel Gibson's portrayal. Wallace first appears in historical records in 1297, already as an outlaw. We don't know exactly what crime he committed to earn this status, but it was likely related to the violent resistance against English occupation of Scotland that was beginning to spread through the countryside. Unlike noble rebels who fought for political power, Wallace was a minor landowner, important enough to have military training, but not significant enough to have much political influence. What made Wallace extraordinary was his military genius and his ability to unite Scottish resistance fighters who normally would never have cooperated. Medieval Scottish society was deeply divided by clan loyalties, regional rivalries, and class distinctions. Wallace somehow overcame these divisions and created an army that defeated English forces in several significant battles. The Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 was Wallace's greatest military achievement. An English army of professional soldiers, heavy cavalry, and experienced commanders approached Stirling, expecting to easily crush the Scottish rebels. Wallace positioned his forces at a narrow bridge crossing, waited until half the English army had crossed, then attacked while the English were divided by the river. The English were slaughtered. Their cavalry was useless on the narrow bridge. Their archers couldn't shoot without hitting their own men, and Wallace's disciplined infantry formations, using long spears called schiltrons, held firm against cavalry charges that should have broken them. The English commander was killed, and his army routed. For a medieval battle where one side held significant tactical advantages, this was humiliating. Wallace was knighted and became guardian of Scotland, but his victory was short-lived. The English returned with a much larger army, defeated Wallace at Falkirk in 1298, and forced him back into outlaw status. For the next 7 years, Wallace conducted guerrilla warfare against English occupation, while also traveling to France and possibly Rome, seeking diplomatic support for Scottish independence. His capture in 1305 was allegedly the result of betrayal by a Scottish knight who was secretly working for the English. Wallace was taken to London, tried for treason, a charge he rejected, arguing that he'd never sworn loyalty to the English king, and therefore couldn't be a traitor, and executed in the most brutal manner medieval law allowed. The execution was designed to be a public spectacle and a warning to other rebels. Wallace was dragged through London streets tied to a horse, hanged until nearly dead, but cut down before he lost consciousness, then disemboweled and castrated while still alive. Finally, he was beheaded, and his body cut into quarters that were displayed in different Scottish cities as warnings against rebellion. The gruesome execution backfired spectacularly. Instead of intimidating the Scots, it made Wallace a martyr whose memory inspired continued resistance. Robert the Bruce, who would eventually win Scottish independence, built his successful campaign partly on the foundation Wallace had laid and the inspiration his sacrifice provided. Let's shift to a very different kind of wanted person. Jan Hus, a Czech priest and scholar who was declared a heretic by the Catholic Church and became one of medieval Europe's most wanted religious fugitives. Hus wasn't a warrior or a thief. His crime was having opinions about church doctrine that disagreed with official teachings. Hus was a professor at Charles University in Prague and a popular preacher who criticized corruption in the Catholic Church. This was dangerous timing, the early 1400s, because the Church was already dealing with several crises and was particularly sensitive to criticism. Hus argued that the Bible should be available in languages ordinary people could understand, not just Latin. He questioned whether priests who were openly corrupt could validly perform sacraments. He suggested that church leadership should be reformed to better reflect early Christian principles. These seem like reasonable theological discussions, but they threatened the church's authority and revenue streams. In 1411, Hus was excommunicated. Rather than submitting, he continued preaching and writing, arguing that excommunication by a corrupt church leadership wasn't spiritually valid. He became a fugitive, traveling between various castles whose owners sympathized with his reform ideas. Hus's writings were smuggled throughout Central Europe, circulated secretly among educated people who shared his concerns about church corruption. He became the center of a reform movement that threatened to fracture Catholic unity in the region. The Church responded by declaring that anyone who harbored Hus or distributed his writings would also be excommunicated, and declaring entire communities under interdict, essentially cutting them off from church services if they didn't turn him in. In 1414, Hus received a letter from the Holy Roman Emperor promising safe conduct to the Council of Constance, where church leaders were meeting to address various theological and organizational issues. The emperor promised that Hus could present his views, defend himself against heresy charges, and return home safely regardless of the council's decision. Hus accepted this offer, traveled to Constance under imperial protection, and was immediately arrested. The council decided that promises of safe conduct didn't apply to heretics, and that Hus needed to recant his teachings to avoid execution. Hus refused, arguing that he couldn't recant positions he believed were true simply to save his life. In 1415, Hus was burned at stake. According to witnesses, he sang hymns while the flames consumed him. His execution sparked immediate rebellion in Bohemia, where his followers, known as Hussites, fought a series of religious wars against Catholic forces for the next several decades. The Hussite Wars demonstrated executing wanted religious dissidents could sometimes create far bigger problems than letting them continue preaching. Now let's discuss someone whose criminal career was so successful that he essentially became a government official. Klaus Störtebeker, a German pirate who terrorized the Baltic and North Seas in the late 1300s and became so powerful that he negotiated with kings and built a pirate confederation that controlled significant maritime trade routes. Störtebeker was a member of the Victual Brothers, a pirate organization that started as privateers, legally authorized pirates who had permission from certain governments to attack enemy shipping. The Victual Brothers originally had licenses from cities opposing Danish dominance of Baltic trade, making them technically legal pirates who were following the orders of legitimate authorities. But as often happened with privateering, the Victual Brothers discovered that piracy was more profitable than legal privateering. They began attacking all shipping regardless of nationality, building fortified bases on islands throughout the Baltic, and creating a sophisticated criminal organization that collected protection money from merchants who wanted safe passage through waters the pirates controlled. Medieval sources describe Störtebeker as extraordinarily wealthy and describe his base at Gotland as a pirate kingdom with hundreds of ships and thousands of men. Whether these numbers are accurate is questionable. Medieval chroniclers tended toward exaggeration. But clearly Störtebeker commanded significant resources and posed a genuine threat to legitimate maritime trade. The legend that grew up around Störtebeker includes several remarkable stories. One tale claims he had a golden chain made that was long enough to reach around the entire city of Hamburg, a symbol of his wealth and a taunt to the city whose merchants he'd been robbing. Another story says he could drink an entire pitcher of beer in a single draught, which apparently was considered impressive criminal credentials in medieval Germany. The most famous Störtebeker legend concerns his capture and execution in 1401. According to the story, Hamburg authorities promised Störtebeker that if he could walk past his crew members after being beheaded, those men would be freed. After the executioner's sword fell, Störtebeker's headless body supposedly walked past 11 crew members before finally collapsing. This legend is almost certainly false. Decapitated bodies don't walk. But it demonstrates how famous Störtebeker had become. He was such an important criminal that his execution required supernatural elements to be truly impressive. The actual execution probably involved Störtebeker and his entire captured crew being beheaded in Hamburg's public square as a warning to other pirates. Moving to England, let's discuss the Fauval Gang, a family of criminals whose career demonstrates how blurry the line between outlaw and gentleman could be in medieval society. The Fauvals were minor nobility who turned to organized crime in the 1320s and conducted a decades-long campaign of robbery, kidnapping, and murder. while somehow maintaining their social status and eventually receiving pardons for their crimes. The Fauvel brothers, there were 7 of them, started their criminal career by murdering a baron who had testified against their family in a property dispute. Instead of facing immediate consequences, they fled to the forests of Leicestershire and began a systematic campaign of robbery and extortion, targeting travelers, merchants, and church officials. What made the Fauvels unusual was their ability to operate openly while supposedly being wanted criminals. They lived in their family manor when convenient, conducted raids when profitable, and seemed to move between legitimate society and outlaw status as needed. This was possible partly because they were nobles who had social connections that protected them, and partly because local authorities were often too weak or corrupt to take action against powerful criminals. The Fauvels' most famous crime was the kidnapping of a royal justice named Richard Willoughby in 1332. Willoughby was traveling through Leicestershire when the Fauvel gang ambushed him, held him captive in a forest camp for several days, and demanded an enormous ransom. After the ransom was paid, Willoughby was released and immediately reported the crime to royal authorities. You might think this would finally bring consequences for the Fauvels, but instead, several of the brothers received pardons within a few years. Medieval pardons were often granted in exchange for military service, and the Fauvels apparently agreed to fight in the king's armies in Scotland in exchange for forgiveness of their crimes. This pattern: commit crimes, receive pardon in exchange for military service, return home, commit more crimes, repeated several times across the Fauvels' careers. The Fauvel gang's story illustrates how medieval law enforcement was often weak, inconsistent, and influenced by social status. If you were noble, well-connected, and militarily useful, you could commit serious crimes and still maintain your position in society. If you were poor and stole a loaf of bread, you might be hanged. Let's turn now to a woman whose story demonstrates that female outlaws faced particular challenges in medieval society. Péronne de la Roche, a French woman who was accused of witchcraft, declared an outlaw, and spent years as a fugitive in the forests of Burgundy in the early 1400s. Péronne's story begins with a property dispute. She was a widow who inherited land from her husband, but his family claimed the inheritance was invalid and tried to take the property by force. When Péronne resisted, they accused her of using witchcraft to murder her husband, a common accusation against women who challenged male authority. Medieval witchcraft trials were notoriously unreliable, often based on spectral evidence, forced confessions, and accusations from people who had ulterior motives. Péronne was convicted based on testimony from her late husband's family, who stood to gain financially from her execution, and from neighbors who claimed they'd seen her speaking to a black cat, apparently conclusive evidence of demonic pacts in 15th century Burgundy. Rather than accepting execution, Péronne escaped custody and fled to the forests. she survived for several years as a fugitive, apparently with assistance from other local women who secretly provided food and supplies. Medieval records describe her as leading a band of other female outcasts who lived in forest camps and survived through begging, theft, and odd jobs performed for sympathetic villagers. Perron's story ends ambiguously. Some records suggest she was eventually captured and burned at stake. Others claim she disappeared entirely, possibly dying in the forest or perhaps escaping to another region where she could create a new identity. The uncertainty itself is telling. Medieval authorities were often less concerned with definitively resolving cases involving poor women than with maintaining social control through threatening examples. Now let's discuss someone whose outlaw status was entirely political. Thomas Becket, who went from being England's most powerful church official to being hunted by the king's assassins in one of medieval history's most famous transformations from insider to wanted fugitive. Becket was Henry II's closest friend and advisor, serving as Chancellor of England and helping the king consolidate royal power. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1162, Henry appointed Becket to the position, expecting his friend to support royal interests in church matters. Instead, Becket underwent a dramatic transformation, becoming a rigid defender of church rights against royal authority. He opposed Henry's efforts to try clergy members in royal courts, insisted that church property couldn't be taxed by secular authorities, and generally made himself an enormous obstacle to Henry's political agenda. The conflict escalated until Becket fled to France in 1164, becoming essentially a high-status political refugee. He spent 6 years in exile, corresponding with the Pope, organizing resistance to Henry's church policies, and becoming an international symbol of church independence from secular authority. Becket returned to England in 1170 after a reconciliation with Henry that proved to be superficial. Almost immediately, Becket excommunicated bishops who had supported Henry during the conflict. When Henry heard about this, he allegedly said something like, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The exact wording is disputed, but the meaning was clear. 4 knights took Henry's words as a command and rode to Canterbury Cathedral, where they found Becket attending evening prayers. They murdered him in the cathedral, hacking him to death with swords, while monks watched in horror. The knights apparently expected to be rewarded for removing Henry's enemy, but instead, they created a martyr whose shrine would become one of medieval Europe's most important pilgrimage sites. The 4 knights, Reginald Fitz-Urse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, immediately became wanted fugitives despite having apparently acted on royal authority. They fled to Scotland, but public outrage over Becket's murder was so intense that they couldn't find safety anywhere in Britain. Eventually, they traveled to Rome to seek absolution from the Pope, who imposed penance requiring them to fight in the Crusades. 3 of the 4 knights apparently died in the Holy Land. The 4th, Hugh de Morville, returned to England years later and spent his remaining years as a monk, trying to atone for the murder that had made him one of medieval history's most notorious wanted criminals. Let's now discuss Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh nobleman who was declared an outlaw by the English crown and responded by launching a rebellion that nearly achieved Welsh independence and made him the last native prince of Wales. Glyndwr's transformation from respectable landowner to wanted rebel began with a property dispute in 1400. An English lord claimed some of Glyndwr's land, and English courts, predictably favoring the English noblemen, ruled against Glyndwr. When Glyndwr protested, he was declared an outlaw, and soldiers were sent to arrest him. Instead of surrendering, Glyndwr gathered supporters and attacked English settlements in Wales. What started as a local property dispute rapidly escalated into a full-scale Welsh rebellion against English rule. Glyndwr was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his supporters and began organizing a government, raising armies, and conducting diplomatic negotiations with France and Scotland for support against England. For nearly 15 years, Glyndwr's rebellion controlled significant parts of Wales. He held parliaments, established government administration, founded universities, and conducted himself as a legitimate ruler rather than a mere outlaw. English forces repeatedly attempted to capture him, but failed despite massive military campaigns that devastated Welsh countryside and economy. Glyndwr's success was partly due to his military skill, and partly due to the difficulty of controlling Welsh terrain. The mountainous landscape favored defenders, and Glyndwr's forces used guerrilla tactics that frustrated English conventional military superiority. English armies could hold towns and castles, but Welsh rebels controlled the countryside and could strike English forces whenever they ventured beyond their fortifications. The rebellion gradually weakened after 1410 as English pressure mounted, and Glyndwr's foreign allies failed to provide expected support. By 1415, organized resistance had largely collapsed, though Glyndwr himself never surrendered. He disappeared from historical records around 1415, with his fate unknown. The English offered pardons to Welsh rebels, but specifically excluded Glyndwr, and substantial rewards were offered for his capture. Despite intensive searches, he was never found. Legend suggests he died in hiding, possibly at the home of one of his daughters, and was buried in a secret location to prevent English authorities from desecrating his body. Glyndwr's disappearance itself became legendary. Welsh folklore claimed he wasn't dead, but sleeping in a cave, waiting to return when Wales needed him. This legend reflected the impact of his rebellion, even in defeat. Glyndwr had proven that Welsh resistance to English rule was possible, and his memory would inspire later Welsh nationalism. Finally, let's discuss someone whose outlaw status was so unusual that medieval authorities struggled to categorize him. Terrorized, a Roman commoner who briefly seized control of Rome, declared himself its ruler, was declared an outlaw by both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, fled into the mountains, supposedly joined a mystical heretical sect, returned years later, briefly ruled Rome again, and was finally killed by the same mob that had initially supported him. Terrorized was the son of a tavern keeper in Rome, but he received a good education and became a notary. In the 1340s, Rome was essentially lawless, controlled by competing noble families who fought each other in the streets, while the Pope lived in exile in Avignon, France. Cola gave speeches criticizing the nobility, idealizing the ancient Roman Republic, and calling for reform. In 1347, Cola organized a coup that expelled the noble families from Rome and established himself as tribune, a title borrowed from ancient Rome. For several months, he ruled Rome with surprising effectiveness, establishing law and order, reforming administration, and even attempting to unify the Italian city-states under Roman leadership. Cola's rule was characterized by increasingly bizarre behavior. He held elaborate ceremonies mimicking ancient Roman rituals, claimed to have mystical visions, and began styling himself with grandiose titles that suggested he saw himself as a quasi-religious figure. This combination of effective governance and apparent megalomania worried both secular and religious authorities. The Pope excommunicated Cola and declared him a heretic. The Holy Roman Emperor declared him an outlaw and a threat to imperial authority. Roman nobility organized armies to retake the city. After just 7 months in power, Cola was forced to flee as the coalition against him became overwhelming. Cola spent the next several years as a fugitive in the mountains of central Italy. According to some accounts, he joined the Fraticelli, a heretical sect that rejected papal authority and lived in remote communities. Other accounts suggest he lived as a hermit, possibly having a genuine spiritual crisis after his dramatic rise and fall from power. In 1350, Cola traveled to Prague and presented himself to Emperor Charles IV, offering information about heresies and conspiracies in exchange for support. Instead of helping him, Charles arrested Cola and turned him over to papal authorities. Cola spent the next 2 years imprisoned in Avignon, awaiting trial for heresy. The trial never happened. Political circumstances in Rome deteriorated so badly that the Pope decided Cola might be useful. In 1354, Cola was released and sent back to Rome with papal support to restore order. Remarkably, Cola successfully returned to power, entering Rome in triumph and reassuming his role as the city's ruler. But Cola's second reign lasted only weeks. His attempts to raise taxes to fund city administration angered the same people who'd initially supported him. When a mob gathered at the capital to protest, Kola apparently tried to escape in disguise, but was recognized. The mob killed him, and his body was dragged through the streets, burned, and left hanging for 2 days. Cola di Rinzo's story demonstrates how complex outlaw status could be in medieval politics. He was simultaneously a genuine reformer who improved governance, a delusional megalomaniac who claimed quasi-divine authority, a heretic condemned by church authorities, a commoner who challenged noble privilege, and ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of populist leadership without institutional support. These stories of Robin Hood, possibly mythical. Eustace the Monk, William Wallace, Jan Hus, Klaus Störtebeker, the Fauvel Gang, Perron de la Roche, Thomas Becket's assassins, Owain Glyndwr, and Cola di Rheims, reveal the complexity of being wanted in medieval society. These weren't simple categories of good and evil. They were people who challenged authority, violated laws, resisted oppression, committed genuine crimes, defended principles, and sometimes did all of these simultaneously. Medieval outlaws operated in a world where legal authority was often weak, inconsistent, or blatantly corrupt, where forest laws made it a capital crime to feed your family, where property disputes could result in witchcraft accusations, where loyal service to the king could transform overnight into wanted criminal status based on political shifts beyond anyone's control. Understanding these wanted fugitives helps us understand medieval society itself, its violence, its injustice, its occasional nobility, and its complicated relationship between law and power. These weren't always heroes, and they weren't always villains. They were people who, for various reasons, found themselves outside the protection of law and had to survive in a world where almost everyone was potential enemy and where death could come from any direction at any moment. Their stories have lasted centuries, not because they were simple tales of good versus evil, but because they captured something essential about human nature: our capacity for both nobility and brutality, our resistance to injustice, our ability to survive in impossible circumstances, and our endless fascination with people who defy authority and live to tell the tale, at least for a while. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps imagine what it was like to be wanted in medieval times, to wake each morning uncertain if this would be your last day, to trust no one completely, to live in constant awareness that law and society had declared you expendable, but to continue surviving through courage, cleverness, and sheer determination, not to give your enemies the satisfaction of your capture. These outlaw stories remind us that history's most wanted were also history's most determined survivors. But the world of medieval outlaws extended far beyond these famous names. For every legendary figure whose story survived in ballads and chronicles, thousands of ordinary people found themselves declared outside the law for reasons that reveal much about medieval society's brutality, injustice, and occasional surprising mercy. The process of becoming an outlaw, known as outlawry, was itself a fascinating legal mechanism that modern people often misunderstand. When medieval authorities declared someone an outlaw, they weren't just saying, "This person is wanted for arrest." They were performing a legal ritual that fundamentally changed the person's status in society, stripping away protections that even the poorest peasant normally enjoyed. An outlawed person lost all legal rights. Their property could be seized without compensation. Contracts they'd signed became void. Marriages could be annulled. Children could be declared illegitimate. And most terrifyingly, anyone could kill an outlaw without facing murder charges. In fact, killing outlaws was sometimes rewarded. This created a situation where wanted fugitives faced danger from literally everyone. The traveling merchant, who seemed friendly, might suddenly attack if he recognized you and thought the reward was worth the risk. The farmer who offered shelter might be planning to turn you in at dawn. Even children could be dangerous. Many medieval communities offered small rewards for information, leading to outlaw captures. And a child hopping to earn a few coins might betray a fugitive who'd trusted them. The geography of outlawry shaped medieval landscapes in ways that still influence modern countryside. The vast forests that covered much of medieval Europe became refuge zones for wanted people who had nowhere else to go. These weren't the peaceful, scenic forests we imagine today, but dangerous wilderness areas where law enforcement rarely ventured, and where various outcasts created informal communities. Medieval forest outlaw camps were remarkably sophisticated settlements, considering the circumstances. Archaeological evidence from documented outlaw hideouts reveals organized living spaces with cooking areas, weapon storage, lookout positions, and even primitive fortifications. These weren't just desperate people hiding in trees. They were organized communities that developed their own social structures, leadership hierarchies, and survival strategies. The Sherwood Forest area in England, famous from Robin Hood legends, really did harbor extensive outlaw communities during the medieval period. Forest records from the 1200s and 1300s document hundreds of people living illegally in areas that were supposed to be reserved for royal hunting. These forest outlaws developed extensive knowledge of the terrain, creating networks of hidden paths, concealed camps, and escape routes that allowed them to evade capture for years. Similar outlaw forests existed throughout medieval Europe. The Black Forest in Germany sheltered fugitives who raided travelers on the trade routes connecting German cities to Italian markets. The forests of Brittany in France became so notorious for harboring bandits that merchants often traveled in armed convoys, and some routes were effectively abandoned as too dangerous. The Scottish Highlands provided refuge for outlaws fleeing English justice. With the difficult terrain and clan loyalties making pursuit nearly impossible, these outlaw communities developed their own economic systems based partly on robbery and extortion, but also on surprisingly legitimate activities. Many forest outlaws worked as charcoal burners, producing the fuel that was essential for medieval metalworking. This work was dirty, dangerous, and poorly paid, but it provided income that didn't require robbing travelers. Some outlaws worked as seasonal agricultural laborers during harvest times, when demand for workers was so high that farmers were willing to employ wanted fugitives without asking too many questions. The relationship between outlaw communities and nearby villages was often more complex than simple hostility. Villages near outlaw forests sometimes developed symbiotic relationships with the fugitives, providing food, supplies, and information in exchange for protection against other bandits or assistance during labor-intensive farming activities. These arrangements were illegal and could result in entire villages being punished if authorities discovered them. But they often provided benefits that outweighed the risks. Some medieval outlaws specialized in particular types of crime that required specific skills and knowledge. Highway robbery, for instance, wasn't just about threatening travelers with violence. Successful highway robbers needed to understand trade routes and schedules, identify which travelers were carrying valuable goods, and recognize which merchants were likely to be protected by armed guards. Medieval highway robbers often worked in organized gangs that controlled specific stretches of road and operated almost like unofficial toll collectors. Merchants traveling through these areas knew they would likely face robbery attempts and sometimes carried decoy money pouches to satisfy robbers while hiding more valuable goods in concealed locations. This created a kind of economic negotiation where both sides understood the rules. Robbers would take a reasonable amount and not seriously harm compliant travelers, while merchants accepted these losses as a cost of doing business. Church robbery was another specialized criminal activity that attracted certain types of outlaws. Medieval churches contained valuable objects, gold and silver liturgical items, elaborate vestments, valuable manuscripts, but robbing churches carried particular risks. Church property was considered sacred, and authorities pursued church robbers more aggressively than ordinary thieves. More significantly, medieval people genuinely believed that stealing from churches would result in divine punishment, making this a crime that many otherwise willing criminals avoided. The outlaws who did rob churches were often people who had already crossed so many lines that one more transgression didn't matter. Some were former clergy who had been expelled from religious orders and felt no particular respect for church authority. Others were desperate fugitives who needed valuable items to sell and were willing to risk divine wrath for immediate survival. Kidnapping for ransom became an increasingly common outlaw activity during the later medieval period, particularly as more people began traveling for commerce and pilgrimage. Wealthy merchants, minor nobles, church officials, and even foreign diplomats were potential targets for kidnappers who could hold them in forest camps while demanding ransom from their families or employers. Medieval kidnapping was often surprisingly professional, with established protocols that both kidnappers and victims understood. Captives were usually treated reasonably well, keeping them healthy, improved ransom prospects, and avoided the additional crime of murder if negotiations failed. Ransoms were negotiated through intermediaries who could communicate with both sides without revealing the outlaws' locations. Once payment was made, captives were released at agreed-upon locations, and both parties typically honored these arrangements. This professionalization of outlaw activities created a paradoxical situation where wanted criminals were simultaneously outside the law and operating according to their own sets of rules that sometimes seemed more reliable than official legal systems. An outlaw gang that was known for honorably releasing ransom hostages might actually be more trustworthy than corrupt local officials who extorted money from travelers through fake legal charges. Female outlaws faced particular challenges in medieval society, where women traveling alone were automatically suspicious, and where the physical demands of outlaw life could be especially difficult. Nevertheless, medieval records document numerous women who lived as fugitives, developed criminal careers, and sometimes achieved notoriety comparable to their male counterparts. Some female outlaws disguised themselves as men, adopting male clothing, names, and mannerisms to avoid the additional scrutiny that women traveling alone would attract. Medieval gender disguise was apparently more common than we might expect. Numerous cases exist of women who lived for years or even decades as men, only being discovered when they were wounded, died, or were arrested and searched. Other female outlaws embraced their gender and used it strategically. Women could access certain spaces and social situations that would be suspicious for men markets, religious gatherings, household areas, making them valuable members of outlaw gangs that needed information about potential targets. Some female outlaws worked as innkeepers or tavern workers, positions that provided legitimate income while allowing them to gather intelligence about travelers carrying valuable goods. The most successful female outlaws often operated in areas where traditional gender roles were already somewhat flexible. Port cities, trade route intersections, and frontier regions where normal social structures were weaker provided opportunities for women to create alternative identities and survival strategies that would be impossible in more settled, traditional communities. Clerical outlaws, priests, monks, and other religious figures who became wanted fugitives were particularly troubling to medieval authorities because they challenged the assumption that religious education and moral training would prevent criminal behavior. When men who had sworn religious vows committed serious crimes, it raised uncomfortable questions about church authority and spiritual legitimacy. Clerical criminals could sometimes claim benefit of clergy. the legal principle that clergy members should be tried in church courts rather than secular courts. Church courts were generally more lenient than secular ones, with punishments focused on penance and spiritual correction rather than execution or mutilation. This created a situation where educated criminals could sometimes avoid harsh punishments by claiming clerical status, even if their connection to the church was minimal. But when clergy committed really serious crimes, murder, robbery, rape, or heresy, they could lose clerical protection and face outlawry like anyone else. Defrocked priests and excommunicated monks who became outlaws were particularly dangerous because they possessed education, social skills, and knowledge of administrative systems that made them formidable criminals. The story of the outlaw priest Geoffrey of Dutton illustrates the complexities of clerical criminality. Geoffrey was a parish priest in Cheshire who was accused of murder in 1304. Instead of accepting trial, he fled and lived as a fugitive for several years, conducting robberies to survive. Medieval records describe him leading a gang that included other rogue clergy, using their religious knowledge to identify which churches and monasteries contained the most valuable portable property. Geoffrey was eventually captured and hanged, but during his trial, witnesses testified that he had continued performing religious services while living as an outlaw. Apparently, some communities sheltered him specifically so he could celebrate Mass and perform other sacramental functions in areas where legitimate priests were unavailable. This created the bizarre situation where Geoffrey was simultaneously a wanted criminal and a practicing priest serving communities that chose to overlook his legal status. The role of sanctuary in medieval outlaw culture was crucially important. Churches and monasteries could offer sanctuary legal protection from arrest to fugitives who reached their grounds before being captured. This created dramatic chase scenarios where wanted people would race toward the nearest church with pursuers close behind, knowing that reaching sacred ground might be the difference between life and death. Sanctuary wasn't unlimited protection. Fugitives could claim sanctuary for a limited period, typically 40 days, during which they could negotiate with authorities, seek pardon, or arrange to leave the country permanently. Many medieval port cities had established procedures for sanctuary claimants to abjure the realm, swear to leave England forever, and never return in exchange for safe passage to the coast where they could board ships to exile. The sanctuary system created complicated moral and legal questions. Should churches protect people who had committed terrible crimes? Did sanctuary undermine legal authority by allowing criminals to escape justice? These debates continued throughout the medieval period, with sanctuary rules being repeatedly modified, restricted, and occasionally expanded based on changing political and religious circumstances. Some famous outlaws made strategic use of sanctuary, claiming protection when pursued closely, then slipping away to resume their criminal activities when the opportunity arose. The sanctuary system required trust between religious and secular authorities, and that trust was sometimes betrayed by clever fugitives who treated sanctuary as a tactical tool rather than a spiritual refuge. The economic impact of widespread outlawry on medieval society was substantial. Areas with large outlaw populations saw decreased trade, abandoned settlements, and agricultural decline, as people were too frightened to travel or work in isolated areas. This created feedback loops where declining economic activity produced more poverty, which drove more people into crime, which further damaged the economy. Some regions became so dangerous that authorities had to offer special incentives to convince people to settle there. Tax exemptions, land grants, and legal privileges were sometimes provided to colonists willing to establish communities in areas that needed population, but were known for outlaw activity. These frontier settlements often had to maintain their own defense systems and develop local militias capable of protecting against bandit raids. The relationship between warfare and outlawry was also significant. Medieval wars created large populations of displaced people, unpaid soldiers, and masterless men who had been trained in violence but had no legitimate employment. When wars ended, these military veterans often couldn't or wouldn't return to peaceful occupations, and instead formed bandit gangs that terrorized the countryside. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1330-71 for 5-3, produced massive outlaw problems in both countries. Demobilized soldiers formed companies of bandits that were essentially private armies, large enough to capture castles and threaten cities. The famous Free Companies that plagued France during the mid-1300s were essentially legitimized outlaw bands that sold their services to whoever would pay, conducting warfare, robbery, and protection rackets with equal enthusiasm. Some of these military outlaws became so powerful that they effectively controlled territories and negotiated with legitimate governments as equals. The most successful developed into regional warlords who extracted taxes, administered justice, and performed governmental functions despite having no legal authority. This created situations where multiple competing power structures existed simultaneously, official governments that claimed authority but couldn't enforce it, and outlaw organizations that exercised actual control despite lacking legal legitimacy. The transition from medieval to early modern law enforcement gradually reduced the outlaw population through several mechanisms. Stronger central governments with better funded law enforcement made outlaw life more dangerous and less sustainable. Improving economic conditions reduced the poverty that drove many people into crime. Legal reforms that made laws less arbitrary and punishments less brutal reduced the number of people who chose outlawry over facing trial. But outlawry never completely disappeared. The romantic image of noble outlaws resisting unjust authority has remained culturally powerful through centuries of social change. Robin Hood, whether or not he was real, has been repeatedly reimagined for each generation as the kind of outlaw that reflects contemporary concerns about justice, authority, and resistance. Modern outlaws and wanted fugitives face very different challenges than their medieval predecessors. Electronic surveillance, international cooperation, and scientific forensics make escape and concealment far more difficult, yet the fundamental dynamics remain similar. Individuals in conflict with legal authority, surviving through cleverness and determination, navigating the spaces between law and lawlessness, and creating their own communities and moral codes when society excludes them from legitimate participation. Understanding medieval outlawry helps us see how the categories of criminal and outlaw are socially constructed rather than natural or inevitable. Many medieval outlaws were created by unjust laws, corrupt officials, or circumstances beyond their control. Their stories challenge simplistic divisions between good and evil, showing how decent people could become criminals and how terrible people could sometimes display unexpected honor. As we drift toward sleep, we might reflect on how medieval outlaws survived in a world that had declared them expendable. Through courage, community, careful planning, and the stubborn human refusal to accept the judgments that more powerful people impose. Their stories remind us that law and justice aren't always the same thing, that survival sometimes requires operating outside official systems, and that history's outcasts were often history's most determined survivors.